Welcome, everyone. So glad you could make it for tayla ealom's dissertation defense. We will get started in a moment, and I imagine that some folks may still continue to trickle in the next few minutes. But for the sake of time, I will go ahead and get us started. So my name is Dr. Alka Aurora. I am tayla's committee chair, and I would also like to introduce her other committee members. I'd like to start with Dr. Janine Canty, who is her external reader, who was external to CIS when she joined tayla's committee, but is now also at CIS. So Dr. Canty is professor of transformative studies at CIS in San Francisco, telecommuting from Boulder, Colorado. Her teaching intersects issues of social and ecological justice, eco-psychology, and the process of worldview expansion and change. Her books include Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices, Globalism and Localization, and Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism and Healing. Dr. Canty, would you like to unmute yourself and just say hello or add anything to that?
Yeah, that sounds all great. And hello, I'm so honored to be here. And yeah, thank you for including me in this committee.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And then Dr. Annette Williams, who is the second reader and also the Women's Spirituality PhD program and MA program department chair. Dr. Williams holds a doctorate in philosophy and religion with a specialization in women's spirituality. Research interests have centered on soul healing from sexual trauma and on the theme of women's spiritual power and agency within the Yoruba Ifa tradition. Among others, she has authored The Divine Feminine in a Yoruba Cosmology, found in Goddesses in Myth, History, and Culture, Wisdom of the Primordial Feminine, Wisdom of Women, Odu Ifa and Yoruba Religious Tradition, in the book Philosophia, Wisdom Goddess Traditions. And the third article listed here is Deconstruction and Reclamation, a healing journey in the book Spiritual Healing from Sexual Violence and Intersectional Guide. And as I mentioned earlier, my name is Alka Aurora. I'm core faculty in the Women's Spirituality program, tayla's chair, and my research and teaching interests are in spiritual activism, integral feminist pedagogy, ecofeminist animal ethics, and also transformative leadership. And let me now introduce what we're all here for, which is Tayla Shanae Ealom's dissertation. Her dissertation examines natural childbirth as an expanded state of consciousness and suggests that a birthing person may experience forms of personal transformation that result in healing from white, supremacist, patriarchal, and anthropocentric ideologies. To do so, her research first presents a theoretical comparative analysis of the existing literature to position childbirth as an expanded state of consciousness. The dissertation then develops the qualitative research methodology of critical organic autoethnography, a new method that synthesizes critical autoethnography and organic inquiry. The dissertation utilizes this hybridized method to analyze tayla's first childhood experience as a bicultural Black woman to illustrate the theory and demonstrate the transformative potential of birth. So that's just an excerpt of tayla's abstract, but I will leave it to Tayla to delve into her dissertation in more detail. So just to give you all a little bit of an overview of what the next hour and a half or a bit more was going to look like. So Tayla will be presenting for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then her dissertation committee will pose questions in 2 rounds. Then we will invite questions from the audience. The committee will then go into a breakout room to deliberate, and we will return with a recommendation. So the recommendation is what, whether it passes with revisions, and so on. So it's great to see the attendance here, great to see some alums coming, some current students, some additional faculty staff, as well as tayla's community. So with that, Tayla, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen first, get that tech part thing out of the way. Okay, so everyone can see that, yeah?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome, and thank you so much for offering your attention here at this moment that has me both anxious and excited. The defense of my dissertation, Disruption, Reclamation, and Delight, a critical organic autoethnography of a Black mother's childbirth as liberatory transpersonal consciousness. Ooh, there's going to be a lot of those tongue twisters throughout here. Before we begin, I just want to offer my gratitude to my committee. Thank you, Alka, Janine, and Annette for your support and guidance throughout my journey. And I also want to offer my loving appreciation to my family, my spouse, Michael Lynn, and our 2 children, Ayane and Amaji, who without them, I wouldn't be here discussing childbirth at all. And I want to dedicate this research to all those that are gestating, birthing, and rearing children around the globe. And I acknowledge the Anishinaabe, whose lands have held me throughout my pregnancies and my births of my 2 children. And also want to honor the Moek territory of San Jose that's holding the Zoom servers that are allowing us to connect across time and space. So thank you to that place. And I'll just acknowledge here at the beginning the incomplete nature of what I offer today. I imagine this presentation as a thumbnail, the dissertation as a photo, and the experience of childbirth, which is something altogether different. So even though it's incomplete, I hope that it satisfies something in all of us. So for those of you that don't know me, I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Tayla Shanae. I am a mother of 2. I identify as a queer, bicultural, Black, gender fluid femme with a strengthening ecological and spiritual identity. And I'm just kind of wandering the world out here with curiosity and seeking embodied freedom. And these identities have really served me in arriving here to this presentation today. And I start this presentation with my birth story. There it is. So in June of 2018, I had the privilege of experiencing a 3-day vision fast in Northern California. And during my fast, I prayed for a vision, and the directive that I received was to become a mother. A few short months later, immediately after relocating to Marquette, Michigan, where I now reside, from Truckee, California, I learned that I was indeed pregnant. And over the course of my pregnancy, I researched childbirth as a cultural practice for both personal and academic reasons. My pregnancy was thus filled with research on how to give birth and a critical inquiry into the systems that support current biomedical approaches to childbirth, including the racist and misogynistic foundations upholding modern obstetric and gynecological practices. My awareness of the natural process of birth rubbed up against my growing knowledge of how white supremacy and extractivism refined medical childbirth at the cost of enslaved Black women. I felt an affinity for natural childbirth and its perspective and the way that it served the narrative I had about myself as a person and the mother I wanted to become. So as a result, I planned for a natural home childbirth and fundamentally rejected all medical approaches to childbearing, especially as someone who identifies as biculturally Black in a predominantly white, relatively rural environment. And at 41 weeks and 4 days pregnant, I went into labor. And after approximately 40 hours of labor and a late emergency transfer to the local hospital, my first child was born. During the first 32-ish hours of labor at home, I entered an intensely altered state of consciousness in which I heard voices, had visions, experienced profound alterations in space and time, transmuted existing perceptions of my identity. The multiple shifts in my perception of reality were vivid, all-consuming, profoundly transpersonal, and transformative. Through this awareness, I came face to face with unseen spiritual realms, unshakable and humbling forces of nature, ancestral inheritances, my ego, and death. This state of consciousness, induced by the intensity and rhythmicity of a natural childbirth, was, in a word, psychedelic. So how can this be? What is this state of consciousness induced by an unmedicated childbirth? How has it changed me? And what is to be made of the total mind manifesting trip that was childbirth? It is this experience of childbirth that has guided me to the doctoral research I present to you today. Ultimately, this research is a personally integrative process, supporting my making sense and use of my first childbirth experience. What I present to you today is this birth story, contextualized within the US birth culture paradigm. I analyze my own birth narrative to uncover how childbirth is a unique expanded state of consciousness that can support deep personal transformation and healing from systems of dominance. I articulate how childbirth bends time, reorganizes space, expands perception, and thus allows for a mystical experience. The research I present here is intensely personal. It is emergent from my encounters with the sacred and the profane in the embodied experience of bearing my first child. I'm defending this research some 4 years postpartum of that initial experience and 7 months almost to the day postpartum of my second birth experience. My positionality as a queer bicultural Black mother has attuned me to the impacts of systemic dominance and compels me to engage in scholarship that supports collective liberation from within my newfound identity in the maternal. So just a brief overview. I'll dive into a little bit of an introduction in the study background. I'll present my literature review, unpack the methodologies that I used, share my findings, my contributions, and conclusions. So Dr. Aurora shared my thesis, but I'll just touch again briefly that I explore the theory that natural childbirth is an expanded state and suggest that in a supportive setting, a birthing person may experience forms of personal transformation that result in healing from white supremacist, patriarchal, and anthropocentric ideologies. I explore the birthing state of consciousness and reveal themes of spirituality and transformational change. And my research utilizes multiple approaches in order to highlight the complexly intersectional realities inherent in the biological act of giving birth. This study is backgrounded by the current maternal healthcare crisis. Currently in the US, we are experiencing high racially stratified maternal mortality and morbidity risks, which directly impact how people approach childbirth, as well as their experiences and outcomes. And these risks are disproportionately distributed across racial lines, with Black mothers and birthing people experiencing some of the highest risks. A few statistics: in 2021, the US maternal mortality rate was 32.9 deaths per 100,000 live births, with Black mothers experiencing 69.9 deaths per 100,000 live births. And in 2022, this maternal mortality rate was some 3 times higher than the next highest among wealthy countries. And these statistics show that Black mothers face 2.6 times the mortality rate during childbirth than any other racialized identity in the United States. So the current cultural practice of medical birth is associating Black maternity with the optics of hypermedicalization, mortality, as well as increased postpartum morbidity. This includes mental health issues that have been linked to adverse birth outcomes. In 2002, Joanne Goldberg was able to link adverse medical births with postpartum depression. And in 2004, Cheryl Totano Beck links routine medical birth with postpartum PTSD. And studies further indicate that mothers are at a higher risk if they have pre-existing trauma history. And this includes trauma exposure experienced by Black birthing people because of overt racism, bias, cultural exposure to racialized violence, and microaggressions. These health risks are also an environmental justice issue, as racial lines map closely with exposure to toxic environments. And in 2022, research was able to identify microplastics in human placenta, which really raises the alarm of the impacts of environmental degradation and maternal mental health outcomes. And while this research didn't point to any causality, the health and well-being of mothers and children in marginalized communities are at an increased risk just due to environmental racism. So my study seeks to address some of these disparities by examining some of the root influences on modern medical birth practices and offer a remembering of childbirth as a unique psychospiritual state that can support personal healing from the systems of dominance that influence medical birth and its outcomes. So a few key terms that I just want to highlight here. I do use the term birthing person to be inclusive of those who do not identify with the cultural meaning of the term woman. I use the term white supremacy to refer to the cultural ideology that centralizes and associates whiteness with superiority and humanness. I use the term patriarchy to refer to the social and cultural system that maintains a core value of dominance, control, and power in all facets of human life. I use the term anthropocentrism, which articulates a cultural assumption that human beings are superior to all other life forms. Expanded states of consciousness, which are a form of altered consciousness that can lead to mystical experience, resulting in a broader understanding of reality, a deepened spirituality, and an increased felt sense of well-being. Transpersonal, which is an epistemology and psychological field that intends to move beyond egoic understandings of self by investigating archetypal and spiritual experience. Natural childbirth, which according to obstetrician Grantley Dick Reed means an unmedicated and uninterfered with labor and birth, in which the major function of the birth attendant is to support the birthing person or woman to relax and have faith in the birthing process. An entheogen, or becoming divine within, which are substances, often plants, that are consumed to produce an expanded state of consciousness for religious or spiritual purposes. And I'll get a little bit into that last one here in just a second. So the research questions that I ask in order to uplift natural childbirth as a practice of cultural production, I ask, can natural childbirth be considered an expanded state of consciousness that is comparable to expanded states induced by the consumption of entheogens? And if so, what are the key aspects of childbirth consciousness? How has my first childbirth experience and my experience of childbirth consciousness been transformative? How has it shaped my sense of self, spirituality, and relationship to nature? How has it supported a felt sense of healing from white supremacy, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism? And to support the investigation into these questions, I contextualize US medical birth by asking, what is this historical sociopolitical context that shapes birth choice, experience, and outcomes in the US? And what were the impacts of this US historical sociopolitical context on my birth choices, experience, and outcome? So it's a bit of a windy dissertation with a lot of different places that I end up. And to get to some of these answers, or maybe more questions, this project first reviews the literature exploring the cultural transformation of US birth practices from home and in the care of highly skilled and spiritually guided enslaved midwives, African midwives, to the medical system. I conduct a theoretical comparative analysis using literature on the expanded states of consciousness elicited through entheogens to argue that birthing people may enter what would be considered an expanded state of consciousness during natural childbirth. And I developed this theory by highlighting parallels found in the existing literature on transpersonal birth and psychedelics research to position childbirth as a relevant and unique psychospiritual state worthy of academic attention. I develop the critical organic autoethnography methodology, which is a synthesis of the rites of passage structure and intentional use of liminality found in the feminist transpersonal organic inquiry methodology, with the self-referential in-depth analysis of critical autoethnography to use the account of my civilian childbirth experience as the primary data source. I then share my experience of childbirth consciousness and highlight emergent transformational themes. And I conclude with sharing personal integrative practices of change to illustrate the theory that childbirth is an expanded state and can serve in healing from systems of dominance. I'll take a resource break for a moment, but you do the same, because that's already a lot. Resource break. Thanks for joining me. Okay, take your time, because now here's another thick one. So the theoretical framework. The lineages of feminist, decolonial, and transpersonal research situate this study. Common among these ontologies and epistemologies is the importance of relationship. And researchers use various methods to find and retell a story in a productive and valuable way. So Black feminist theory emphasizes Black women's cultural heritage as a source of empowerment and posits that reality has material differences based on interconnected subjectivities influenced by race, gender, and class. I engage with the decolonial praxis, which involves the deconstruction of colonial tendencies embedded within research assumptions and methods to permit the emergence of erased, silenced, devalued, and decentered knowledges. Transpersonal theory, which posits that mystical experience, altered and expanded states of consciousness, and ecstasy are entry points to the human psyche that hold the potential for transformational and liberatory learning. Ecofeminism, which holds a historical, symbolic, and political relationship between the denigration of nature and the female feminine woman in Western culture. And finally, I hold an eco-psychological theoretical framework that founder Theodore Roszak notes as, quote, proceeds from the assumption that at its deepest level, the psyche remains sympathetically bonded to the earth that mothered us into existence. My work also relies on many scholars who have paved the way for this particular conversation. So I draw heavily on the gifts offered by Robbie Davis-Floyd, Pamela Clausen, Rochelle Chadwick, Pam England, and Rob Horowitz, who articulate a feminist critique of existing birth culture practices. And notably is Davis-Floyd's Birth as an American Rite of Passage, which is a really gut-wrenching articulation of the ways in which medical birth is a practice of what she calls the technocratic model, and that medical institutions use birth in order to reproduce patriarchy. And technocratic model is this understanding that our technological artifacts are embedded in and formative of our worldview, and that their primary uses will reflect and perpetuate the paradigm of that underlying worldview. I also call on predominantly Black voices from the reproductive justice movement, including Dorothy Roberts, Alicia Bonaparte, Julie Chinyere Oparaya, Loretta Ross, and Sabia Wade. And Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body provides a clear and no-nonsense history of the foundation of brutality on Black maternal bodies in the creation of modern US obstetrics. I lean on expanded states authors such as Ralph Metzner, Richard Williams, and Mark Whitman. I lean on Black feminist theorists such as Patricia Hill Collins, and ecofeminists such as Donna Haraway. And I also extensively lean on the work of natural childbirth educators such as midwife Ina May Gaskin and obstetrician Grantley Dick Reed, among many others. So in order to effectively argue that natural childbirth may support healing from systems of dominance, I first contextualize modern medical childbirth practices as an extension of white supremacy, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism. This context provides insight into the childbirth landscape that dictates how people approach childbirth. So I map out midwifery as a Black women's tradition and articulate the impacts of white supremacy and patriarchy on the development of the professional field of obstetrics. And then I highlight the different movements that created with the technological influences on birth, the home and natural birth movement, kind of resulting in the great biomedical natural birth divide. I also touch on spirituality and how it is experienced in the two different settings, the impacts of trauma in the medical field, and how that contributes to US culture. And so I review literature from the reproductive justice movement, the natural home birth literature, midwifery studies, and medical birth outcome research. And this lit review is illustrative of how systems of dominance have resulted in the current medical practice of birth. And each of these bodies of literature address various aspects of my inquiry, but fail to really bring them into conversation with one another. For example, reproductive justice literature highlights the impacts of racialization and gender on childbirth, but not necessarily the roles of nature or spirituality. Home birth discusses the transpersonal potential of natural childbirth and privileges in ecocentric philosophy, but avoids much political engagement and doesn't necessarily address systemic dominance. Finally, the existing literature doesn't necessarily conceive of birth as a unique psychospiritual state. So my research approaches birth in such a way that seeks to bring racialization, gender, nature, culture, spirituality, and healing into conversation with one another by highlighting how they intersect during childbirth. And my study contributes to the literature by weaving these narratives together. And my firsthand account of childbirth consciousness and in-depth articulation of the interactions I had with the transpersonal realms provides a missing narrative. So I have a two-prong approach to this to get to some of these answers. Oh, excuse me. Oh no. There we go. Okay. So first, I provide a theoretical comparative analysis to develop the theory that childbirth is an expanded state of consciousness with transformative and healing potential. And I utilize this to analyze and offer important insight to the pertinent social issue of childbirth. This process compares existing literature on the therapeutic implications of entheogens and transpersonal childbirth to articulate childbirth as an expanded state. And I chose entheogens for several reasons. I had previous experience before this studying and using entheogens for my personal healing, and the literature I was reading while pregnant then initially sparked the impulse to look deeper. And when I did, I found that both experiences are immediate and time-bound. Both the natural birth movement and the psychedelics renaissance as we experience them today have modern roots in the counterculture of the 1960s, but are actually ancient traditions in which a shaman or midwife knew how to guide people in a spiritual dance between the worlds. And these practitioners have a shared history of state-sanctioned violence and eradication over the globe, but as well as Black and Indigenous communities in the US, particularly under the guise of medicalization and professionalism. So this comparative analysis reveals patterns in experience. And I can then test the theory by looking at my personal narrative and matching my experience patterns with the theoretical patterns I unearth in the comparative. And by utilizing a comparative approach, I develop a unique theory about the phenomena of childbirth and situate it within the purview of consciousness studies. And then to compare my narrative to this theory, I develop a new methodology to capture and relay my narrative, critical organic autoethnography, which is again the synthesis of critical autoethnography and organic inquiry. So critical autoethnography, which is the research method that centralizes critical reflexivity by centering the researcher's personal narrative, and organic inquiry that blends the seen and unseen aspects of experience to create a rich and nourishing research framework that honors the intersection of feminist and women's spirituality. And it assumes that all things are interconnected and sacred, and that the sacred can influence every step of the research process. Which takes the researcher and the research through a three-phase iterative data collection, analysis, and reporting process called preparation, inspiration, and integration. So weaving organic inquiry with critical autoethnography involves introducing the methodologies of invoking liminality, and the iterative process of preparation, inspiration, and integration into the process of data collection and analysis in the review of my autoethnographic account of childbirth. By examining my personal story for transformation throughout the project, the autoethnography becomes rooted in the cyclical nature of organic inquiry and is presented as a narrative of lasting psychospiritual change. So I chose these two different methodologies. And here's that. Sorry, these are lagging. I chose these the theoretical comparative analysis and critical organic autoethnography for several reasons. Again, I want to first put forth the theory. And so the comparative analysis allows me to theorize the patterns and transformative potential of childbirth consciousness, which is a necessary step for me to test the theory against my personal narrative. And then I develop critical organic autoethnography to integrate the sacred into research and attribute academic value to sacred awareness emergent from women's ways of knowing, integrate a methodology that utilizes the framing of rites of passage, which follows the same logic applied to birth and the therapeutic use of entheogens, and also incorporates liminality, which is also a through line in all the subjects being explored. And it allows for critical reflection on my own narrative and brings the personal into direct interaction with the politics of reproduction. So for my methods and research design of the critical organic autoethnography, I reviewed personal primary data sources to generate a self-reflective narrative of childbirth. So I used my pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journals, personal social media posts during pregnancy, birth photos taken during labor at home and after my transfer to the hospital, a narrated birth story film I created in the immediate postpartum period, and written accounts of my birth story. And each offers a different perspective on my journey, from the highly private world of my journals to the more public display of maternal transformation on my social media page. And each provides artifacts of my first pregnancy and birth to reflect both internal struggles and socially constructed concerns, allowing me to effectively oscillate between the personal and the social, and then back again. And finally, these sources remain separate from my research journals on childbirth and personal to me, highlighting my unique pregnancy and birth experience as a civilian. In the analysis phase, in line with organic inquiry, I employed the three-step process of preparation, inspiration, and integration when analyzing the data sources. So I reviewed each source 4 times, each time engaging in the liminal realm before reviewing the data. I utilized 2 forms of liminal access, thinking and movement. Organic inquiry developer Jennifer Clement states that meditation and contemplation are traditional access points to the liminal. So I did a focused meditation, and then I also engaged in mindful dance, which has always been an access point to the liminal for me. Upon entering into the liminal state and reviewing the data sources, I would then engage in a critical reflection log, which included somatic tracking to make meaning of the data. I noted how each source informed, or each theme informed the organic inquiry notion of transformative change, either toward a deepened sense of connection with spirit, new self-knowledge, or a change in worldview and a longing to be of further service. And from the integration process of the data review, I crafted 3 stories: my story as the participant, the thematic stories emergent from the data source, and the transformative change I experienced through both giving birth and the research process. So taken together, they paint a picture of my childbirth, the themes that emerged from the state of consciousness achieved within that birth experience, and the transformative aspects of pregnancy, birth, and the birth storytelling process. And I was able to create a web of thematic elements as an inventory of my state of mind during pregnancy and childbirth. And just a brief note on selecting these themes: many themes emerged that I retain for my own growth and reflection. The iterative analysis process was also a process of discernment for me to be in dance with those that felt unintegrated or would be overwhelming against those that felt accessible. And it feels important to note that while these themes are rich and robust, they are not the entire experience of my pregnancy or my childbirth. Another resource break. So to get into the findings, going back into the theoretical comparative analysis through an investigation into the literature, I found that natural childbirth and entheogen-induced expanded states both alter the experiences of time, space, and perception. Changes in time include the transcendence of linear time, which has been identified as a key indicator of mystical experience. And research points to this in both birth and in entheogen-induced states. The experience of time drastically alters as one is entering the birthing state of consciousness, and research has shown that time seems to be transcended and transcends the experience of clock time. That seems to have brought the profane and the sacred into unifying oneness. And in the case of entheogens, which Richard Williams claims that when people are having a mystical experience, they are unaware of the passage of time. In birth and entheogen research, the notion of space also drastically changes, and this is in reference to physical space as well as the internal space or the experience of spatiality. Kathleen Fahey and Jenny Ann Peratt have introduced the concept of birth territory, which describes, explains, and predicts the relationships between environment and the way a woman experiences labor and birth. And there's also the experience of spatiality, which is the arising of a specific inner spiritual space, where an internal state becomes a space in which extraordinary things reveal themselves. And then returning to the work of Richard Williams, the transcendence of space results in an awareness of the eternal that is both everywhere and nowhere in an entheogen-induced state. And finally, both childbirth and entheogens alter perception. So during birth, the literature shows that birthing people may feel they've been given a vision or are being spoken to by an outside source. And entheogens are commonly referred to as hallucinogens, as they are thought to generate hallucinations in the form of visual and auditory apparitions, from the dishabituation of perception, where the ordinary field looks brand new, to global hallucinations, or where the scene before the eyes is totally changed. So through the mechanisms of changes in time, space, and perception, consciousness changes and expands in both childbirth and entheogens. And along with these changes, various transformative themes also emerge within the literature, namely a connection with the divine, a connection with nature, and an expanded sense of self, which I will touch again in my findings in the autoethnographic account. But spiritual aspects of childbirth and entheogenic healing amplify how these two profound states transforms a person's way of knowing the divine more directly. And they conclude that they allow for an embodied revelation, and that they can be the most significantly mystical or spiritual experiences of an individual's life. So now I want to present the findings of my critical organic autoethnographic account, where I start with my pregnancy. So my autoethnographic research explores the complete rite of passage of my first childbirth experience. I use the organic inquiry methodology to review the artifacts from 3 distinct phases of my rite: pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, to uncover the various themes that served in my personal transformation and healing. Pregnancy was the preparation phase of this journey, and also the set or mindset that I held prior to engaging with the process of childbirth. And ultimately, it highlights the ways in which orienting toward birth and the motherhood that follows can be an all-encompassing process throughout the duration of pregnancy. The analysis revealed 4 pregnancy themes: surrender, identity formation, sexuality, and spirituality. Each theme was directly related to my experience of gestation and, in hindsight, influenced my childbirth experience. For example, the theme of surrender was emergent from the extraordinary bodily transformation of pregnancy. It became a corporeal engagement of letting go with the previous sense of embodied self as my body grew and morphed and changed. And then once in labor, I was confronted with my ability to surrender to the powerful forces of biological birth. And then once I entered the second phase of the rite, the childbirth itself was a moment in which I engaged with the unknown altered state of consciousness. And the organic inquiry, iterative analysis of birth photos, videos, and written narratives, as well as the short film I made, revealed major themes and sub-themes of childbirth consciousness. The original natural childbirth themes from the literature review were revisited, from the comparative analysis revisited, and as well as emergent medical childbirth consciousness themes. And I further delineate several sub-themes that supported the transformation. The information gathered in reviewing my journals and media depicting my birth experience support my initial exploration into childbirth as an expanded state of consciousness at the foundation of this work. And additionally, the data reviewed impacts of racialization and medicalization through the exercising of power dynamics once the birth was transitioned to the hospital. So I experienced a deepened connection with the divine through access to various presences that provided guidance, instruction, and encouragement concerning the birth process. So I experienced a change in perception with the involuntary auditory guidance and reflection from an unknown and unseeable presence. I experienced change in perception and changes in space with the involuntary visualization of liminal locations, so feeling as though I had been transported to new locations. I had a deepened connection with nature through the sense of belonging with other with others, both human and more than human, that give birth as a regular aspect of life on this planet. 2 sub-themes that supported this. I had a change in perception and in space with the involuntary visualization of multiple animal births. I had a change in perception and a change in space with the involuntary visualization of major Earth events such as hurricanes and volcanoes erupting. I had an expanded sense of self, which became evident through the experience of this connection with the divine and nature. And these connections revealed a transformed sense of identity based on this sense of interconnection. So I experienced a change in perception, which is the immediate and undeniable sense of interconnection and belonging with all life-producing elements and participants on this planet. And I also had a change in perception, which was a redefinition of kinship. The white male gaze became a theme of influence once I was transferred to the hospital and directly influenced the childbirth experience, childbirth consciousness experience. I had the presence of a white male obstetric doctor, which undeniably influenced my awareness. It altered my perception of time and of space, where I developed a dual awareness of myself as a patient and as a force of nature simultaneously. And I had a change in my experience of time with the introduction of clock time, and the influence of a sense of external control over the birth experience. And the final theme that presented itself was fear, which entered once I found myself in the hospital as well. And that resulted in a change in perception and time, where I was now more outward and noticing changes in my support team's attitude, and a change in time, which was my ability to remain in control of my birthing body in relationship to Chronos time, and then a change in space, or a feeling that I had entered a void and was lingering in a no place between birth and death. So transformative change is a big part of this process and this research. And transformation of the researcher is a key function of organic inquiry research, and the only true marking of validity in that field, which it doesn't mean that the results are generalizable or replicable. So I conclude here with the integration phase of the rite, which was postpartum, the immediate postpartum. From the critical organic autoethnographic account presented, my deepened connections to the divine nature and an expanded sense of self have sustained the change over the past 4 years of mothering my firstborn, thanks in part to a commitment to a variety of integrative practices that have served to deepen my newfound awareness and connection. In the dissertation, I share 3 examples of these integrative practices categorized under the organic inquiry umbrella of transformative change in the areas of spirit, self, and service. So in the category of transformation of spirit, this is manifested through the commitment to ancestral healing practices, specifically with my Black lineages and departed, through the ritual unforgetting of familial Black dead. Through to the transformative change towards service, it has manifested through a commitment to Donna Haraway's notion of odd kin making and a remembering myself as an ecological being related to the more than human world and dedicated to multi-species reproductive justice. Transformative change in the category of self has manifested through the personal commitment to a more empowered and embodied sexuality and embracing creative impulse inherent in my femininity and femaleness. And each of these practices serve in healing from the influence of systemic dominance. These systems that seek to forget the Black dead, dislocate humans from the embeddedness in nature, and demonize and sterilize the maternal of sexuality. Oh, right. So my research makes various contributions to a variety of fields. I offer a articulation of US childbirth history under the influence of systems of dominance, I articulate childbirth consciousness and underscore key characteristics of this psychospiritual state, and I highlight how it can serve in personal healing. So in the end, the autoethnographic account of my first birth experience highlights how childbirth consciousness deepened my connection to the divine, nature, and an expanded sense of self, all of which influenced my beliefs and behaviors to support a felt sense of healing from white supremacist, patriarchal, and anthropocentric belief systems. This research does not seek to deepen the medical natural birth divide, but articulates the impacts of set and setting and the impact they have on the experience of childbirth consciousness, and argue that a supportive set and setting can profoundly influence the birthright. The hospital interventions likely saved my life, and even still, the setting of the hospital and the enactments of the hospital staff unconsciously reinforced cultural practices of systemic dominance that sought to imprint upon my psyche. In contrast, the natural birth consciousness themes I experienced are what propelled me to engage in the integrative practices I've shared here. Like more well-studied, expanded states of consciousness, childbirth catalyzed transformative change above and beyond the transition into motherhood. These transformative changes are multiple, complex, and interwoven with the lived experience of spirituality, nature, and self. The critical organic autoethnographic account, along with existing literature and the theoretical comparative analysis, positions childbirth as an extraordinary state of consciousness with significant implications for creating, maintaining, and transmuting cultural norms by empowering those that birth to act in accordance with their sense of autonomy. Finally, the research exemplifies how the set and setting of a childbirth experience directly influences the birthing person's ability to access mystical awareness and can thus support or impede healing experiences. The presented findings open the door for future research on the role of profound healing as an aspect of personal and potentially social healing from systemic dominance. My recommendations, some that I touch on in the dissertation, are to address some of these root causes and reorient toward labor and delivery in such a way that supports birthing people in their process. And I would recommend further investigation using small and large population samples to establish a more nuanced map of childbirth consciousness. But the presented research shows that there is much to investigate about childbirth as a unique state of consciousness and its transformative potential. How we find liberation through cultural reproduction begs that research focuses on the physical acts of reproduction that generate culture. And by listening to birthing people's experiences, we open the doorway to the most common and vastly mysterious realms of human consciousness. And we may well birth a new world. So I conclude with just a snapshot of my two rugrats. It's their fault. And I'm very indebted to them. My eldest, Ayane, and my newest, Amaji. So thank you for your attention here.
Thank you, Tayla. What a wonderful way to conclude by bringing a smile to all of our faces. There was so much richness and depth in what you offered. Perhaps we can all take a couple of breaths as we integrate that. I think that resource break idea was really lovely. Also give you a chance to catch your breath. So what we're going to be doing now is moving to a round of questions from the committee, and then we'll go to a second round from the committee members, and then we will open it up to audience questions. So Dr. Williams or Dr. Canty, do either of you have a question in mind that you'd like to start us out with?
Dr. Canty, please.
Okay. Let me see. I have two questions. I'll start with I guess maybe the more challenging one, although I don't think it is. And first off, Tayla, I'm just so amazed at all you've done here and accomplished and are contributing. And it's just amazing that you did this and birthed two children and moved so many the pandemic, so many things. And so I hope you're feeling really good to get to this point. And the question I'll pose is kind of less detailed, specific, but kind of in your wildest dreams. I mean, this is probably not your dream, but if you were to do your whole methods design again without time constraints, money limitations, responsibilities, what, if anything, might you change?
Mm. Mm. Thank you for that question. I think that there's kind of two answers that want to come through. One is maybe do less or do more. There'd be do less or do more. And so I got a lot of richness and found a lot of value in the theoretical comparative analysis and actually digging. I had a longing to dig deeper into the history of childbirth and deeper into the history of entheogens and really find deeper parallels that I feel are there in relationship to how we approach the cultural inheritance of these things, how colonialism has impacted both of these systems, and really kind of get deeper into the history of those two ways in which expanded states are induced, and also what kind of shared histories of repression and violence they actually have, and kind of get a little more curious. There was a limitation to how deep I could actually go because I was also in an integrative process of wanting to test the theory against my own experience. So there's one part of me that wants to dive deeper into that history and get more curious and find more nuance. And I think that there's some part of me that still feels like there's something to keep digging there from maybe more of an anthropological perspective. And then on the other side of that, there's this longing for more, which is more voices. And how do I move forward in such a way, which is actually a longing of future research and a dream I have, is to actually integrate my theory and my experience inside of like kind of a circle share, and being in relationship to other mothers, other birthing people, other folks who have gone through this experience, to actually really map out as much nuance to this expanded state as we can find, as well as highlight what are some of those really key aspects that have been transformative. And that's actually a longing that I have for future research. If I find myself pursuing a longer tenured role in academia, is to actually say, this is the launching point. Who wants to be in circle here? And who wants to have this conversation and bring it kind of away from the kitchen table a little bit, which is where I feel a lot of these conversations with mothers happen, and kind of map out what is this thing that we go through that is really devalued or shadowed or hidden, and what is this map? What is this experience that we're having? And do we collectively have something that's uniting us other than just like the physical experience of having given birth? So less personal narrative and more history, or more personal narrative in relationship with lots more people. And it feels like this was the launching point for maybe both of those. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Dr. Williams?
Thank you. So Tayla, it was wonderful. Thank you. I love history and the context, and I really appreciated how you situated your experience within the context of the history of the medical birthing establishment. And I wanted you, I mean, there are two phrases that you have that you use, and one is that childbirth is a territory, And so it's a location where culture reproduces itself. And you speak to the technocratic birth and how birth is used to perpetuate patriarchy. And it's like, I was giving you a chance to fill those out because I think they're so rich and so important as concepts. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So the term technocratic birth or technocratic model actually comes from Robbie Davis Floyd in her book, The Birth as an American Rite of Passage. And she really unpacks how the influence of technology and the abundance of technology that is influencing the trajectory and experience of medicalized birth are actually symbols that serve in imprinting the notions of patriarchy and the principles of patriarchy on women and people who are birthing in the hospital setting. So clocks, IVs, gowns, name tags, birthing on the back, stirrups, all of these things that have become associated with a medical birth are these highly technocratic technological advances that are privileging the influence and the instrumentation of the medical system over the natural rhythm and movement and flow of a birth. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that it's like the least advantageous to labor and birth on your back, and yet the medical system is still in that establishment, or it still is in that setup. And so when entering into the medical institution, the institution and its setup, the way that it's established creates an entire field of symbols that somebody in an altered state is entering into that then can imprint the values of those symbols. So those values seek to devalue or even dehumanize and depersonalize a birthing person. It's no longer about them being upright and able to engage, but their feet in stirrups with the main focus on the baby and on their vulva ultimately, and the doctor being between their feet. And so in this way, the medical establishment and all of the habits that it has developed through the development of the fields of obstetrics and gynecology serve to put the doctor in the position of power inside of that dynamic. And regardless of necessarily the gender of that doctor, the institution is still a male-focused and male-driven institution. And so through that, the imprints of the clock and of the male, the kind of power of the institution is sought to imprint on the psyche of the birthing person at this really expanded state of consciousness. So these symbols are then being put in to serve them so that as they deliver the baby, they come out with on a very subconscious level often, right? But a belief in the power of technology in their role as subservient to that technology, and on some layer have integrated the principles of patriarchy. Yeah, that framing, especially in her book, was really a 1-2 punch for me. Really, really deep. And then I wanted to expand on it to really articulate that it's not just the impact, an imprinting of patriarchy, but also of white supremacy, and also of technocratic approaches, which are ultimately anthropocentric, or the idea that we have power over nature.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tayla, I wanted to also commend just the breadth and depth of your work, as is an incredibly complex piece of work, and seeing it, condensed into a 40-minute or 45-minute presentation, rather than reading, a long dissertation, I think helped me connect some of the pieces really well. So I really appreciated your work on that. I also wanted to note kind of your link here between, you start with some very somewhat alarming statistics about maternal health disparities. And then you move from that very macro level to a very micro level in terms of your personal experience. So my question, in a sense, builds upon the other two questions, which is, keeping in mind the reality of these maternal disparities, and also the fact that there are, providers and policymakers and so on and so forth working to address these in multiple realms, which are, as we know, are also, they're based in economics and institutionalized racism and all of these things. But from the vantage point of your dissertation, your research, if you were giving a talk to an audience of policymakers and healthcare providers and people sort of in this system who are trying to affect change on the, not just the mortality rate, but the experience, right, that all birthing people are having, what are some things you would want to really like hone in on for them? And of course, there may be like 20, right? But just a few things that you feel like are really particular to your vantage point, given your research. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think I got you. Thank you for the question. I think that this is where the theoretical comparative analysis is one of the bigger leverage points in the research. Specifically, when we're looking at, so I'm going to dive into entheogens for just a moment, but when we're looking at the existing research, which is problematic and in multiple ways, so we'll just hold that. But when we look at the ways in which the clinical trials are being engaged for the use of entheogens for healing, say from postpartum, from PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety. They are not doing these expanded states in a hyper-sterilized medical room in which people are hooked up to IVs and there's nurses coming in and out and all of these different things. The setting very much so is supportive of their process, even if it's not perfect. There's a couch, there's music, there's sacred symbology, there's someone there simply to hold their hand and to reassure them that that they can do what they've come to do. While yes, there are different medical risks involved with giving birth than there are from taking entheogens, there are medical risks in both events. And one is being more treated as a sacred passage than the other, but both are sacred passages. And so I think that there's something to really leverage in our understanding of that expanded state, its impacts on how people transform, its healing potential that is being grounded in that medical research with entheogens that could really be of service to saying why are we doing this expanded state in such a way that is really quite scary. It's very much an operating room. It's very much and this isn't to say that that's the case across the board. There are, of course, birthing suites, there are, of course, birth centers being built, and there are suites in which there are pools and showers, and there's an effort being put in. But ultimately, labor and delivery wards are not necessarily a really welcoming place to be. And so I think that at the very basic level, really addressing set and setting and allowing for that landscape for the birth territory, as they noted, that actual space to not consistently be an enactment of overt power dynamics. I think that's one of the things that I would really lean on there, because it's just so, it feels so obvious. If we're doing expanded states one way, we need to honor that across the board, especially as it relates to gender and race and they're intersecting in an expanded state.
Great answer. Thank you. And I would also imagine that those fancy birthing suites with the pools are more accessible to, higher income, largely white, mothers rather than across the board. So
yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Janine, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. And let's see, I almost kind of have two, but I'll maybe condense it. Well, Tayla, your research is incredibly unique, and I actually think you did such a great job in terms of the theoretical research. I mean, all of it, but you really went deep, weaving together so many areas of intersectional research. And so I think that your work could have a really significant impact. And so I guess part one, how do you intend to get this out to a larger audience, and what intentions do you have as an academic and activist? And then I guess part two, which is more of a pop-up question, is in terms of accessibility. I think everyone who's here is like so with you. I'm assuming we're like a very feminist community, and we can go deep and feel the emotions and be supportive. But to maybe some outside readers of your work, they'd be like, oh, she's talking about like fluids and her feelings, and in like real rich narrative descriptions, and white male gazes and all of these pieces. So where do you, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Both and, yeah. Well, I think I definitely have a longing to like use the information that's been given to me through my birth in order to support what is already happening in certain ways inside of a birth culture that actually supports people who birth and getting born themselves, and finding a way to actually be transmuted and feel empowered and feel held, and find their own sense of power and agency in their own divine connections in nature. And so there's this part of me that I had to giggle in like reviewing this and putting my presentation together. It's very academic kind of approach to telling a very basic human experience, basic being that it's as human as we get in so many ways. We've been doing it since we've been here, giving birth. And so it's this really, it felt almost jarring to try to put the two together in some way, to put this like really academic language around this really sacred and ineffable experience. And so there is a longing I have to follow the breadcrumbs in a way, and continue to be in an interrogation of this as a site of culture production, and actually trying to use it as one of those microcosms to understand the larger social systems that we're in. And that gets me excited as a scholar. And I feel like after I completed like putting together my slides, I was like, oh, I feel like I want to go into scholarship on this. I actually want to continue to enhance the field of maternal studies and enhance the field of consciousness studies by weaving them together with the really rich kind of feminist and Black feminist critiques that are available. So there's definitely a longing to continue to dive into it. And at the same time, I have a longing to tell the story a different way, to tell the story in a way that also isn't such a mouthful, but is more of like of that visceral experience, so that it becomes more accessible outside of academia. I feel that there's so much here that wants to continue to like tumble me. I feel tumbled by the process, like one of those rock tumblers, where there's a longing to be in some of the scholarship and continue to kind of bring this erased and dismissed site of knowledge production into academia, and also create a platform or contribute to the platforms that make physical, material, boots on the ground change for people who give birth. So I, just like my dissertation, I have lofty ideas, and they'll always end up being way bigger than I think they are. And yeah, I think did I even answer the questions?
You very much did.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Both and.
I know you started to, when you're answering basically the question I am going to post you. You're speaking about healing as the site of deep transformation and deep healing. It's like, so how do you translate this to most people, most birthing people, right? Who are not going to read this dissertation. They're not going to go into the deep history to understand this. And I was reading, I'm like, okay, there are these birthing classes. So let's take Lamaze out. How do we put this in? You know, how do bring it? Honestly, how do we really bring this to more people, to a mass of people who are, like I'm saying, are not in these realms of academia or ivory towers, but how do you bring it on, put it on the ground? And when you spoke that, because it's so valuable, it calls for you know, very like an extremely conscious approach to one's birthing. I said it already has to be there, where the person has this or grows to learn and know of the way that birthing can be so incredibly powerful and transformative. You know, so it's like I see this whole new birth training coming into being, you know, around this, like starting small, you know, put it into a Lamaze class, you know, here and there. But sort of like infiltrating.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was thinking about it earlier today, and I'm thinking about the ways in which our culture projects childbirth and the optics of it, the idea of it. I'm thinking about, you know, movies and you know, popular depictions of childbirth, and I'm also thinking about the rites of passage framework and the real privilege it was to write a dissertation that ultimately allowed me to deeply integrate childbirth, which is a real privilege, because on the other side of childbirth, you have kids, and there's not a lot of space, generally speaking, especially in Western culture, for the person who has given birth to really reckon with how they have changed, not just that they are now a mother, but that they are themselves. And this doctoral process has really allowed me to return to myself more whole. And so I think that there's the layers of, you know, childbirth education, and how does this frame actually get provided to people who are pregnant and preparing to give birth, but then also how do we support families and communities in actually creating those spaces necessary for mothers and birthing people to create the integrative practices that allow them to make meaning out of their birth experience. That feels like the one of the larger questions I really feel like I'm sitting in is, how do we make space for the meaning making process that isn't just, oh, you have a baby now, which is the default, that birth is always about the baby in our culture, and how do we actually create space within our communities and with the people that we know that have given birth, that there's something that they went through, and that's rich territory for them to enjoy and learn from.
Thank you. And you speak to some of the rituals that you and, you know, like the blessing way, or even thinking back to the granny midwives and their role and that, and in the Black community, that there are many people who are coming back to home births or some sort of hell birth outside of the hospital model, because it's so, you know, when you have people who are middle class and upper middle class Blacks who are dying or near death. I'm thinking of Serena Williams and childbirth. It's like, what? Yeah. There are places and ways. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, my second question actually segues or is related to what you were just sharing, and it has to do with one of your central findings being around identity formation. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, especially from your vantage point now of having birthed 2 children and being, you know, having a 4-year-old and not just being a brand new mom. And I want to give some context to this question. It's more also around the ways in which motherhood is simultaneously unsupported in our culture and also sort of put up on a pedestal in a way. Right? So yeah, I wonder if you could just invite comments about your own identity formation as a mother.
Yeah, thank you. I was reflecting on this earlier. one of the real gifts of pregnancy that I experienced, and that I still, I think, it feels like it's like the current, under the current of all of the other themes that I engaged with, was the notion of surrender and how to allow for becoming. And pregnancy is this real unavoidable dance with surrender, where your body will change and it's going to morph and grow. You're growing a new organ, you're growing a new human, everything is evolving. You don't like things you used to like. You like things you used to hate. I didn't eat chocolate for my entire pregnancy with my first kiddo. I'm made of chocolate. So all of this kind of surrender of just how do I let myself just become different, is ultimately what I feel the identity of formation has really been about, is that motherhood has taught me I am a process. I am an unending, ever-changing, ever morphing, confusing, and simple process. And through each my iterations as a mother, I am more myself and something else entirely. And I'm thinking about how I remember looking at my firstborn and being like, oh man, I'm a first-time mother of you as a baby. And now I have a 7-month-old and I'm a first-time mother of this baby. And when my kids are 12, I'll be a first-time mother of 12-year-olds. And when they're 35, I'll be the first-time mother of 35-year-olds. And when I'm entering into cronehood, I'll be a whole different version. And so there's this way in which that pregnancy really allowed me to stop imagining myself as static in any of my identities, and really forced me to reckon with and celebrate myself as process, as a never-ending and unfolding process. And in the dissertation, I talk a lot about identity formation as mother. And now that I'm here on this side, I'm recognizing that identity formation is surrender into process. Mother just happens to be one of the languages that we use for it. And that feels like it also really rubs up against systemic dominance that wants to hold everything in static categories, and then put some assumptions of behavior, assumptions of expectations, limitations on those static categories. It really rubs up against that, which is also allows me to decenter my human notions of self, because if I look at the world around me, everything else is in process all the time as well. So that's kind of the answer I have for identity formation.
Beautiful answer, Tayla.
Thank you.
Well, this concludes a round of committee questions. So I would like now to invite some audience questions and dialogue. Comments are welcome as well as questions.
I would love to step in. Hi, Tayla.
Can you speak up just a little bit, Desiree?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, super obsessed with your whole topic, all of your research, everything. Fantastic. And I had kind of a twofold question. One is, I have a curiosity around why your second birth experience wasn't included in your dissertation, whether it was just too recent and didn't fit in because you already finished everything, or what that was, just because personally having birthed 3 times, each time has been its own separate, unique experience. And then the kind of second fold piece of that question is, what maybe did you gain from your second experience that you didn't have in the first one, and how might that shape this work moving forward for you as well?
Thank you. Thank you. So my goal with this dissertation was to have it written before I had my second baby. I really wanted to focus. It was such a deep dive into that particular experience that I wanted to give that experience the entire dissertation. But the second birth is included as my epilogue. And so I actually finished like a whole draft right before my second baby was born, and then included the second birth story as part of an epilogue, which makes note of some of the things I learned in that first experience that I directly integrated as practices throughout pregnancy for my second, to influence my birth experience the second time. And while my first birth experience took 40 hours and an emergency transfer to the hospital, my second took 4 hours of active labor and was born at home in a birth tub in my bedroom. They were extraordinarily different experiences, and so much of what I learned about surrender, so much of what I learned about sexuality and embodiment and rest, and so many of those things that kind of I felt were rubbing up against my experience in the first time. I packed my hospital bag just in case, which I didn't do the first time. So there were a lot of things that I was humbled by, as well as and integrated as important information to support me the second time. And it enabled me to access childbirth consciousness from a different place and be less overwhelmed by it. And then I had just a shorter stay as well. So yeah, the story is there. It's just as a nod and a continued, now that I'm still in the 7 months postpartum, still, nursing and doing all of those things. I'm very much still in the kind of unearthing of some of the themes and treasures inside of that experience. And still deeply getting curious about how to integrate that one. So yeah, I hope that touches on it, but they're very, very different. It's incredible. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, I lost my thought, but thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Desiree, for your question. Other comments, questions?
Oh, Susan?
Son, are you speaking? You're muted.
Hi, I have a question. I want to know if you can attach your research into condemning oppression, so you get more audience, like as feminists, how they don't allow us to feel this type of birth, and then connect that to activism, that how they don't allow us to voice this as a person, and also to spiritual, so they don't allow us to express our spiritual experience. So all that makes the audience or the people who are hearing you expand. So like, if I'm just activist, I read it and I said, yeah, that's it. Or spiritual, you just feel it, that this is our woman's voice, spiritual woman's voice. So yeah, I want to know how can you attach that, and if it's possible, or if you did that,
Yeah, thank you. In the kind of preface to the dissertation, I first make a claim and really position the research as an act of spiritual activism, in the tradition of Anzaldúa, as an offering into the world, that right now the biomedical model is an extension of these systems of oppression, and that what they are oppressing is this really critical knowledge and information that comes from a very specific state of consciousness that people who give birth experience, and that experience has incredibly critical knowledge of how we relate to each other and the world. And so I really do position actually the dissertation itself as one of the first steps toward engaging in an activism that wants to deconstruct these systems of oppression on childbirth and make space for these silenced experiences inside of those systems, if that makes sense. Does that kind of touch on your question? It feels very much like I'm efforting toward an active activism in writing the thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Susan, for your question. Thank you, Tayla. We have time for a couple more comments or questions. Kati?
Hi, Tayla. I just want
Hi.
to say hi and appreciate you so much and everyone. So good to be here in this space with community. And I just want to acknowledge your work and everything you've done and everything that you are, and the depth of this research, of this labor of love and activism. I admire you so much, and I hope I get time to read this amazing work and continue to learn from you and with you. Yeah, many kisses and flowers and roses and chocolate for you and your babies and your family.
Thank you, Kati. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kati. Gaia.
Hi, Tayla. Oh, so much ditto. Kati said it so well. Just so many blessings to you. Just so honored to be here and to witness you in this long love labor. And just congratulations. Thank you. Thank you for your depth of inquiry and for living the experiences. Oof.
Mm-hmm.
I have a curiosity, and it might be too much of a personal question, but who knows? We'll see. You be in choice with how you want to answer it. I'm curious if there were experiences during your birthing process. In particular, I'm hearing kind of like the part at home, and it may bridge over into the experience in the hospital that you references connecting with spirits and voices, and if there's a particular one who wants to be named or kind of image from that story that you've been able to connect with that internal composting of patriarchy, of white supremacy, and how you've kind of been in the meaning making of that. Because just curious for a little bit of that story, if you're open.
Yeah, thank you. And is it too personal? I don't know. I go into depth in it in the dissertation. But there's like in my connection with the divine, there was definitely an unseen, unknown to me feminine presence that showed up and was the one that was providing a real steady, clear narrative for me. And she just kept saying, this is good pain. So kind of trying to tend to the part of me that was panicking about the pain. This is good pain. This is how babies are born. And so she's been a presence. She was a presence in that experience that has guided me into a deepening of my ancestral healing practices, and kind of I don't have a name for her at this point still, but she was the one that kind of guided me in that familial lineage of unforgetting my Black dead in particular. It was very much in meditation and in integration of that on the other side, that she was a black presence in that birthing experience. Another that was really profound for me, there was a moment in which I saw volcanoes erupting and hurricanes moving across landscapes and tornadoes touching down. And this same presence just came in and said, this is creation. And I felt myself as though I was a hurricane, as though I was a volcano, as if I was a land mass making more land mass. And so it was that experience. That was also another really profound experience that supported me in that one, alongside with like being able to witness other animals giving birth. That was another vision that I got of wild animals giving birth, and those visions in particular supported my sense of ecological self and a deepening of like oddkin making. Donna Haraway's notion of oddkin making, a multi-species relationship, and feeling myself move out of this kind of human-centered contraction around giving birth into the larger history and stories of all life that does this thing on this planet, and a deepening sense of kinship. So those are some of the examples of those very particular visions, or those guidances that I was receiving that I've continued to pull on the thread of how does that inform how I show up in the world.
So powerful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Devotion.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Thank you. Well, at this point, our program coordinator is going to place the committee into a separate breakout room for deliberations. The rest of you are welcome to keep chatting informally, to taking a resource break. Tayla, if you need to take a break, feel free to do so. We'll just be out for 5 at most.
Welcome back.
Well, after some intense deliberations, we're actually very much in agreement that we would like to heartily congratulate you, Dr. Ealom, for your exceptional work here. And we think you did a wonderful job with your defense, and are really, really excited with what you put together. And, I'm already thinking about your next steps, but absolutely you need a long resource break as well.
Absolutely.
Project.
Ooh,
Congratulations
thank
to you.
Yes, congratulations, Dr.
Thank
Ealom.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yay, thanks.
Doctor.
I was so nervous. I can't even tell you all.
It did not show. It did
Oh,
not
good.
show.
I was like, oh my God. Thank you all so much. And thank you for just